Okay, so you want to own a football stadium, a giant bowl of concrete and steel, 80,000 seats, your name on the roof, and a packed crowd roaring every Sunday. People pay just to walk through the gate. They pay again for parking. They pay again for a beer and a hot dog. And a television network pays a fortune just to point cameras at the field. It sounds like the ultimate money machine. One building, one team, and a river of cash pouring in every game day. It sounds simple. It is not simple. And the story of how stadiums actually make money and how they quietly bankrupt the people who build them is one of the strangest stories in all of finance. Before you collect a single ticket, you have to survive building the thing. And a modern football stadium is not a big purchase. It is one of the single most expensive private structures a human being can commission. When the Los Angeles Rams built SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, the final cost came in at over $5 billion. Not 500 million, 5 billion, with a B, for one building that hosts football maybe 10 times a year. When the Dallas Cowboys built their stadium back in 2009, it cost around $1.2 billion at the time, and it was considered a monument to excess. A decade and a half later, that number looks almost quaint. When the Las Vegas Raiders opened Allegiant Stadium in 2020, the bill was around $1.9 billion. The newest stadiums are pushing past $2, $3, $4, $5 billion each. And that is before you understand what that money actually buys. The land alone can cost hundreds of millions because a stadium does not just need the bowl. It needs parking for tens of thousands of cars, road access that can absorb a small city arriving and leaving in the same 2 hours, power infrastructure, water, and enough flat cleared land to swallow an entire neighborhood. Then you pour the concrete, raise the steel, hang a scoreboard that can cost more than an entire office building on its own, and satisfy a mountain of zoning, safety, and environmental rules. By the time the ribbon gets cut, you have spent more than it costs to build a major hospital on a building that will sit completely dark and empty most days of the year. Here is the first thing nobody tells you when they picture owning a stadium. You are not really buying a building. You are buying a bet on a schedule, and most of that schedule is empty. Now, who actually pays for all this? Because this is where the story gets stranger than almost anything in real estate. For most of the last 50 years, the answer was, not the team owner. The public did. Cities and states have poured tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money into building stadiums for privately owned teams. The way it works is almost always the same. The team owner goes to the city and says, "We need a new stadium. If we don't get one, we might have to move to another city that will build us one." And that threat, the threat of losing the team, is the single most powerful negotiating tool in American sports, because a city that loses its football team loses something no spreadsheet can measure. So the city agrees to fund a huge share of the cost, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, through bonds backed by taxes on hotels, rental cars, or the general public. Look at how Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas got built. The Raiders wanted out of Oakland, and Nevada agreed to put in $750 million of public money, raised largely through a tax on hotel rooms, to help fund the new building. $750 million, one of the largest public contributions to a stadium in American history, handed to a privately owned team so it would move to town. The tourists paying that hotel tax will never see a dividend. The team owner keeps the franchise. That is the deal over and over in city after city. Economists have studied this for decades, and they are almost unanimous. The public rarely gets its money back. A stadium is used for football a handful of days a year. The jobs it creates are mostly part-time and seasonal. The promised economic boom for the surrounding area usually fails to appear because money spent at the stadium is mostly money that would have been spent somewhere else in the same city anyway. And yet the deals keep happening because the leverage keeps working. This is the airport trap in a different uniform. Just like a small airport that has to bend to a single budget airline, a city bends to a single team, because without the team, the building has no reason to exist. Say the stadium is built. Before you collect a single dollar of profit, there is a layer of costs that ambushes almost every new stadium owner. First, there is the debt. Whether the money came from the public, from the owner, or from a bank, someone borrowed billions, And the interest clock started ticking the day the loan arrived, not the day the first game was played. Every month of construction delay is a month of paying interest on billions while generating zero revenue. Second, there is the anchor-tenant problem, and it is a strange one. The main tenant, the football team, often pays shockingly little rent, or in many cases owns the building outright and pays nothing at all. The team is the reason the building exists, so it holds all the power in the lease. You inherit whatever deal was struck, good or bad, and it usually favors the team, not the building. Third, there is the maintenance monster. A stadium is a machine with tens of thousands of seats, miles of plumbing, elevators, escalators, a playing surface that must be perfect on camera, and lighting and sound systems that cost millions to run and maintain. All of that decays whether anyone is sitting in the seats or not. The roof still needs repair. The field still needs care. Security systems still need power. And here is the trap door under the floor. The stadium generates almost all of its money on maybe 20 or 30 days a year, but it costs money to exist on all 365. Here is where it gets interesting, because the way a stadium makes money is far more layered than most people realize. The first and most obvious layer is ticket sales, the gate. Every fan who walks in pays for a seat, but the gate is not where the real money hides. The second layer is the one that actually matters, and it is called premium seating. Luxury suites, club seats, and personal seat licenses. A single luxury suite in a top stadium can lease for hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, sometimes over $1 million for the best boxes, and a stadium might have 100 or more of them. Club seats, the premium seats with special access and service, cost multiples of a regular ticket. And then there are personal seat licenses, one of the strangest inventions in the business. A personal seat license is a fee, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, that a fan pays just for the right to then buy season tickets for that seat. You pay for the privilege of being allowed to pay again. When MetLife Stadium was built for the Giants and Jets, personal seat licenses raised close to $1 billion before a single game was played. Ride that again. Fans paid roughly $1 billion in fees, up front, just for the right to then purchase tickets. That is the second layer, and it dwarfs the gate. The third layer is naming rights. Why is it called SoFi Stadium, or MetLife Stadium, or Allegiant Stadium? Because a company paid enormous sums to plaster its name across the building. Naming rights deals for the biggest stadiums run into the tens of millions of dollars per year, locked in for 20 or 30 years. A company might pay $600 million total, spread over decades, just to put its logo on the roof. That is money flowing in every year whether the team wins or loses, whether the seats are full or empty. But naming rights hide a strange risk of their own, and it is one of the best cautionary tales in finance. What happens when the company that bought your roof goes bankrupt? It has happened again and again. When the Houston Astros opened their ballpark, they sold the name to a company called Enron. Then Enron collapsed in one of the most infamous accounting frauds in history, and the team had to pay to buy its own name back and rename the building. The New England Patriots opened their stadium as CMGI Field, named after a dot-com investment company, but CMGI's stock cratered before the doors even opened, and the deal fell apart. It became Gillette Stadium instead. The Baltimore Ravens once played in PSINet Stadium, named after an internet company that went bankrupt, and the name had to be stripped off the building. So that reliable stream of naming rights money, the income that was supposed to flow no matter what happened on the field, turns out to depend entirely on a company you do not control staying solvent for 30 years. Tie your roof to the wrong company, and the safest revenue line on the page can vanish overnight. The fourth layer is everything you consume once you are inside: concessions and parking. A stadium has a total monopoly on food, drink, and parking on game day. There is no competition inside the gates, so the prices are whatever the owner decides. And just like the mall kiosk that sits in the busiest walkway, position is worth more than space. A tiny beer stand at the top of an escalator, in the path of 80,000 thirsty people, generates staggering revenue per square foot. Parking is the same. The stadium owns the land all around itself, so it owns the only place to park, and it charges accordingly. On a big game day, parking alone can bring in millions. But here is a detail almost nobody outside the business knows. The stadium owner usually does not even run the food and drink themselves. They hand the entire operation to a specialist concessions company, and that company signs a contract that works almost exactly like the deals in a mall or an airport. The concessionaire agrees to pay the stadium either a guaranteed minimum amount for the year or a percentage of everything sold, whichever is higher. So the owner is protected on the downside no matter how the season goes. A losing team and a half-empty stadium still triggers the minimum guarantee. A championship run with sold-out crowds means the owner takes a slice of every $20 beer and every $18 plate of nachos. The owner is not really in the hot dog business. The owner is renting out a captive, thirsty, hungry crowd of 80,000 people to somebody who is in the hot dog business and collecting a toll either way. And layered on top of all of it is a fifth stream, advertising. Every surface of a modern stadium is for sale. The giant scoreboard, the ribbon boards that wrap around the seating bowl, the digital signs along the field, even the gates and entrances carry a sponsor's name. Companies pay year after year to put their logos in front of a captive crowd of 80,000 people and a television audience of millions, and that signage money flows in whether the team is winning or losing. But here is the counterintuitive part, the detail almost nobody sees coming. All of that money, the suites, the tickets, the beer, the parking, only happens on game days. And a football team plays only 8 or 9 home games in a regular season. That means the most expensive building in the city produces its core income on roughly 10 days a year. The rest of the calendar, it is a dark, empty, multi-billion-dollar liability. So the entire second business of a stadium, the thing that separates a profitable stadium from a money pit, is filling the empty days. Concerts, other sporting events, college games, conventions, monster truck rallies, religious gatherings. A stadium that can book 50 concerts a year is a fundamentally different financial animal than one that only hosts football. The building is the same. The economics are completely different. Occupancy of the calendar, not occupancy of the seats, is where owners quietly win or lose. Before we get to the costs, it is worth understanding something stadium designers figured out long ago, because it explains almost everything about how these buildings are shaped. A modern stadium is not designed for watching football, it is designed for spending money. The concourses, the wide hallways where the crowd flows between the seats and the exits, are lined wall to wall with food, drink, and merchandise, positioned so that no fan can get to their seat, or to a bathroom, or back to their car, without walking past a dozen chances to spend. Just like the mall developer who spaced the anchor stores far apart to force shoppers past the smaller shops, the stadium architect routes 80,000 people through a gauntlet of concession stands and team stores every time they move. And the newest trend goes further. Instead of a handful of luxury boxes at the top, the entire building is now sliced into tiers of premium experiences, clubs, lounges, field-level seats with private bars, each one priced higher than the last. The goal is simple. Every choice about how the building is shaped is designed to increase the amount of money each person spends between the parking lot and the seat. That is the entire commercial logic of a stadium in one sentence. Force movement, and you increase spending. And here's a good question. If economists agree the public rarely gets its money back, why do cities keep paying? Because the value of a football team to a city is emotional, not financial, and emotion does not show up on a spreadsheet. A mayor who lets the team leave becomes the mayor who lost the team, forever. So the leverage works every single time, and owners know it. That is why the same story, a team demanding a new stadium and threatening to leave, has repeated in city after city for 50 years. The building is a business decision for the owner and an emotional hostage situation for the city, and the city almost always pays the ransom. It is worth pausing on that second business, filling the empty days, because it has quietly become one of the most important things separating a winning stadium from a losing one. Consider what a single blockbuster concert tour can do. When one of the biggest musical acts in the world rolls through and books a stadium for 2 or 3 nights, packing 80,000 fans in each night who pay for tickets, parking, food, drink, and merchandise, that handful of nights can generate as much revenue for the building as several football games combined. And a football team only gives you 8 or 9 home dates a year. A packed concert calendar can hand you dozens. This is why the newest stadiums are designed from day one, not just for football, but to convert quickly into the world's biggest concert venues, with staging, acoustics, and access built in. The owner who understood this early turned the dead space in the calendar into the most profitable part of the whole operation. The football team is the anchor that justifies building the place. But increasingly, the concerts and events on the other 300 days are where the building actually earns its keep. A stadium that cannot fill its empty nights is a stadium slowly bleeding to death between Sundays. So far, a stadium sounds like a machine that prints money from 5 directions at once. Now here is the other side of the ledger. The operating costs of a building this size are enormous, and most of them do not care whether anyone is inside. Keeping the lights, climate control, and systems running across millions of square feet is a permanent bill. Security staffing for a crowd of 80,000 requires a small army. Cleaning a stadium after a single game is a massive operation. Insurance on a multi-billion-dollar structure is brutal and climbing every year. Property taxes, where they apply, can be one of the single largest line items of the year. And none of these bills shrink on the 340 days a year when there is no game, no concert, and no crowd. The building costs a fortune to simply sit there and exist. And then there is the cruelest cost of all, the one that ends every stadium's life: obsolescence. A football stadium has a shockingly short useful life, 30 years, sometimes less, before it is considered outdated. The suites are too small. The technology is behind. The competing city just built something newer and shinier, and once a stadium is declared obsolete, its value does not just decline, it collapses. Because a football stadium was built for exactly one purpose, and it does not convert into anything else. You cannot turn 80,000 seats into apartments. This is the structural truth underneath the whole industry. A stadium is worth a fortune the day it opens and can be worth almost nothing 30 years later, no matter how well it was built. To understand how brutal that collapse can be, it helps to look at one real stadium, from opening day to demolition. The Pontiac Silverdome opened in Michigan in 1975. It cost around $55.7 million to build, an enormous sum for the time. It was a marvel, the largest stadium in the National Football League, with a roof held up by air pressure and room for over 80,000 fans. It hosted a Super Bowl in 1982. It hosted a basketball game during the 1994 World Cup. Elvis Presley and other legends performed there. For years, it was the beating heart of the region, home to the Detroit Lions and one of the most famous buildings in the state. Then, the Lions left. In 2002, the team moved to a brand new stadium in downtown Detroit, a shinier, more modern building. And the moment the anchor tenant walked out, the Silverdome's financial floor fell out from under it, exactly the way it does when a department store abandons a mall. The building was suddenly a gigantic structure with no reason to exist and enormous costs to keep alive. The city tried to sell it for years. In 2009, the Pontiac Silverdome, a building that had cost $55.7 million to build and had hosted a Super Bowl, was sold at auction for $583,000. Not $583 million, $583,000. Roughly 1% of what it cost to build, and it got worse from there. The new owners could not make the building profitable either. The roof deflated and tore. Nature moved in. Photographs from inside showed the field turned into a swamp, snow piling up on the seats, the whole structure rotting from the inside out. Eventually, the building was demolished in stages, and the land was cleared for other uses. Keep this in mind if you ever think a famous stadium means a safe stadium. The Silverdome hosted a Super Bowl. It took less than 3 decades to go from that to a wrecking ball and a pile of concrete. The line between those two states was not one dramatic event. It was the day the team decided the building was old and left, and the Silverdome is not some ancient exception. Consider the Georgia Dome in Atlanta. It opened in 1992, cost a few $100 million, hosted a Super Bowl and Olympic events, and was one of the premier stadiums in the country. It was not old. It was not falling apart. But in 2017, barely 25 years after it opened, it was imploded, reduced to a cloud of dust in seconds, because the team wanted a newer, fancier building right next door. 25 years. That is the useful life of a structure that cost hundreds of millions to build. A house lasts a century. A well-built bridge lasts longer. A football stadium, one of the most expensive buildings a person can commission, can be dynamited before it is old enough to rent a car. This is the obsolescence trap in its purest form. The building did not fail. It was simply declared out of fashion, and in this business, out of fashion means gone. But if you want the single most brutal illustration of how stadium finance really works, look at the Kingdome in Seattle. It opened in 1976 and cost about $67 million, paid for with public bonds, money the taxpayers borrowed and promised to pay back over decades. It was home to football and baseball. It hosted a huge share of the region's biggest events, and it was considered a workhorse of a building. Then it was declared obsolete. In the year 2000, after just 24 years, the Kingdome was imploded to make way for a newer stadium. Here is the part that should stop everyone cold. The public was still paying off the debt on the Kingdome for years after the building no longer existed. The bonds that built it were not fully retired until around 2015, roughly 15 years after the stadium had been reduced to rubble. Read that again. Taxpayers spent a decade and a half paying for a building that had already been blown up and hauled away. That is the obsolescence trap and the public financing trap fused into one number. The concrete was gone. The debt was not. Now hold that story next to a completely different kind of failure. One where the building never even got the mercy of demolition. The Houston Astrodome opened in 1965 and was so far ahead of its time that people called it the eighth wonder of the world. It was the first fully enclosed, air-conditioned, domed stadium ever built. A genuine marvel of engineering that changed what a stadium could be. And then the teams left, one by one, for newer buildings, and the marvel became an orphan. But because it was famous, because it was historic, nobody could quite bring themselves to knock it down, and nobody could figure out how to make it pay for itself either. So it has spent decade after decade sitting there, mostly empty, too iconic to demolish and too obsolete to use, while plan after plan to convert it into something profitable has come and gone. The Astrodome is the other ending. Not a dramatic implosion, but a slow, expensive limbo. A building that costs money to keep standing and earns almost nothing, frozen because it is too special to kill and too outdated to fill, and you do not even need a demolition or a decades-long limbo to see the trap close. Look at the Oakland Coliseum. For years it was home to a football team and a baseball team, a busy, publicly owned building in a major market. The county had borrowed money to renovate it, expecting the tenants to stay and the events to keep coming. Then the football team left for Las Vegas and its shiny, new, publicly funded stadium, and the baseball team started planning its own exit too. Suddenly, the public was left with an aging building, shrinking tenants, and something most fans never think about. The debt from those old renovations did not leave when the teams did. Local taxpayers were still on the hook for tens of millions of dollars in borrowing tied to a stadium the marquee tenants had walked away from. Same pattern as the Kingdome, just without the dynamite. The team leaves, and the bill stays. That is the risk that runs through this entire business. A stadium does not fail because the sport failed. It fails because it was built to depend on one tenant staying, and one shiny competitor across town is all it takes to make that tenant leave. The team can always threaten to go somewhere newer. That threat is the same leverage the owner used to get the building funded in the first place. Only now, it points the other way. There is one more piece to understand, because it explains why owners keep building these things despite the risk. And it is the smartest trick in the entire business. The owner has learned to separate the two halves of the deal. The building, the risky part that becomes obsolete and can end up sold for the price of a house, is increasingly paid for with public money, bonds backed by taxpayers. But the team, the part that appreciates relentlessly and is worth billions, stays private, owned entirely by the owner. In the best deals, the public carries the downside of the concrete while the owner keeps the upside of the franchise. The city takes the risk that the building becomes a white elephant. The owner takes the reward of a team that only goes up in value. When a new stadium like SoFi opens with premium seating and suites and personal seat licenses generating enormous sums, that money strengthens the team. And the team is the asset that never seems to fall. Understand this and you understand why the game keeps being played. The stadium is the bait. The franchise is the prize. And whenever possible, the owner arranges for someone else to pay for the bait. And this is why the numbers seem backwards at first glance. A stadium can lose money as a building while making its owner extraordinarily rich, because the building and the team are two different assets, pointed in two different directions. The concrete depreciates toward zero. The franchise compounds toward the sky. NFL teams that were bought for a few $1 million decades ago are now worth several billion each, and they climbed that entire way regardless of whether the stadium turned an operating profit in any given year. The building is a cost center dressed up as a trophy. The team is the real machine. Miss that distinction, and none of the economics makes sense. See it clearly, and the whole strange industry snaps into focus. So, does owning a football stadium actually work as a business? The honest answer depends entirely on which stadium, and the gap between the good outcome and the bad outcome is enormous. In the optimistic scenario, you own a modern stadium in a large, wealthy market with a beloved team locked into a long lease, luxury suites that sell out for years in advance, a naming rights deal worth tens of millions a year, and a calendar packed with concerts and events on the days there is no football. In that case, premium seating, sponsorships, naming rights, and non-game events together produce steady, predictable income across the whole year, and the value of the franchise attached to the building climbs relentlessly. This is the outcome that turned a handful of stadium and team owners into some of the richest people on the planet. In the realistic bad year scenario, the team underperforms and stops filling the seats. The novelty wears off, and premium suite renewals soften. A newer stadium opens in a rival market, and suddenly your building looks dated. The concerts you counted on to fill the empty days go to the newer venue instead. Meanwhile, the debt payments, the insurance, the property taxes, and the maintenance keep coming every single month because those costs are tied to the size of the building, not to how many events it hosts. The empty days that were supposed to be filled sit empty, generating zero income while still needing to be lit, secured, and maintained. And if the team ever decides to leave, the building goes from priceless to nearly worthless overnight, because it can never be anything other than what it was built to be. Neither scenario is exotic. Both happen constantly, sometimes to the same building only a couple of decades apart. The Silverdome itself lived through the optimistic version first. A Super Bowl, a sold-out house, the pride of the region, before sliding into the version that ends at auction for the price of a small house. The building did not change. The economics underneath it did. A stadium looks from the outside like a monument. From the inside, it is one of the most fragile financial structures in existence, an enormous fixed cost that only earns on a handful of days and depends entirely on one tenant choosing to stay. The team does not just play games there. It is the single reason the building has any value at all. And when it leaves, it does not just leave an empty field. It pulls the financial floor out from under a $5 billion building and leaves the owner holding a bowl of concrete that the world has already decided is too old to want, sometimes with the debt still owed long after the concrete is gone. So if you decide to own a football stadium, understand what you are actually buying. You are not buying a money machine. You are buying the most expensive empty room in the city, 340 days a year, and betting that 25 days of roaring crowds plus one team that could leave at any time are enough to pay for all of it. In the right city, with the right team and the right calendar, it is one of the most glamorous assets in the world. The question is whether the crowd keeps coming back long enough to fill it.